The mist hung low over the barren countryside, clinging to the skeletal trees like a shroud. The only sounds were the rhythmic clatter of hooves on dirt and the creak of the carriage wheels. Dr. Robert Cargrave sat inside, his hands gripping a letter that had arrived weeks earlier, its contents still troubling him deeply. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smudged in places, as if written in great distress. "Come at once. Only you can help. The matter is of life and death." The letter bore the signature of Maud, a woman from his past, someone he had once held dear. That alone was enough to compel him to undertake the long, arduous journey into the remote heart of Central Europe. He had no idea what awaited him, but as the carriage rounded a bend and Castle Sardonicus came into view, an uneasy chill crept up his spine. The castle was a monstrosity of shadow and stone, its jagged spires stabbing upward into the cold moonlit sky. Its windows were dark, like empty eyes staring out into the night. Even the carriage driver, who had been mostly silent during the journey, seemed unnerved. "I'll take you no closer," the driver muttered, his voice trembling. Dr. Cargrave protested, but the driver only shook his head, crossing himself before turning the carriage around. Cargrave had no choice but to walk the final stretch alone. The air grew colder as he approached the towering oak doors of the castle. Before he could knock, they creaked open slowly, as if the castle itself were alive and waiting. Inside, he was greeted by a tall, gaunt manservant whose face was a patchwork of scars. One of his eyes was shut permanently, and his expression was grim. "You are Dr. Cargrave," the man said, his voice low and guttural. "The master has been expecting you. Follow me." The man introduced himself as Krull as he led Cargrave through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and shadows seemed to dance on the walls as their footsteps echoed. Finally, they entered the grand hall, a cavernous room dominated by a long table and a massive fireplace. Seated at the head of the table was Baron Sardonicus. Cargrave froze at the sight of him. The Baron's face was a grotesque mask, his lips curled upward in a hideous rictus grin that stretched his skin taut. It was not a smile of joy, but one of horror, as though he had been frozen mid-scream. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were filled with torment, pleading for release. "I trust you understand the urgency of my request," the Baron said, his voice hollow and strained. Cargrave nodded, struggling to maintain his composure. "Your condition, it is unlike anything I have ever encountered." Before he could ask further questions, the door opened and a woman entered the room. Cargrave's heart sank as he recognized her. Maud. She was as beautiful as he remembered, though her eyes were heavy with sorrow. She avoided his gaze as she sat down beside the Baron, her posture stiff and formal. Over the next few days, Cargrave began his work. The Baron explained the origins of his condition in a series of tense conversations. Years earlier, Sardonicus had been a different man, a commoner named Merrick. His life had changed the day his father died, leaving him and his mother penniless. Desperate for money, Merrick's mother revealed that the winning ticket for a lucrative lottery had been buried with his father. Driven by greed, Merrick violated the grave, digging up the coffin and prying it open with trembling hands. What he saw inside was never fully explained. Merrick refused to describe it in detail. But the horror of that moment had twisted his face into its permanent grimace. Soon after, he assumed the title of Baron Sardonicus, using his newfound wealth to purchase the castle and isolate himself from the world. But Sardonicus's affliction was not merely physical. His disfigurement seemed to have poisoned his soul. He became a cruel and sadistic man, delighting in the suffering of others. Cargrave witnessed this firsthand during his stay. Sardonicus frequently humiliated Krull, forcing him to perform degrading tasks, and his treatment of Maud was even worse. She stayed silent about the specifics, but her haunted expression spoke volumes. As Cargrave worked on a treatment, he grew increasingly determined not only to cure Sardonicus, but also to free Maud from his clutches. Using his expertise in experimental medicine, he prepared a serum designed to relax the facial muscles and reverse the condition. The night of the treatment arrived. The grand hall was eerily silent as Sardonicus sat in a high-backed chair, his grotesque grin illuminated by the flickering firelight. Cargrave injected the serum carefully, watching as the Baron's expression began to change. Slowly, the muscles in his face relaxed, and the grin faded. For the first time in years, Sardonicus's face appeared almost normal. But the moment of triumph quickly turned to horror. Sardonicus began to scream, a guttural, inhuman sound that echoed through the castle. His face contorted again, this time into an expression of sheer terror. He clawed at his skin, his eyes wild with panic. It's not the serum, Cargrave realized aloud. The horror of his deeds has consumed him. His mind is the true prison. Krull rushed into the room, his deformities making his movements awkward but determined. You must leave, he hissed at Cargrave. The master will not forgive this failure. Cargrave hesitated, but Maud grabbed his arm. He's right, she whispered. We have to go now. Together they fled the castle, racing through the dark corridors as Sardonicus's screams grew louder behind them. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as if the castle itself were alive and angry. Outside, the night air was cold and fresh, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the castle. They climbed into a waiting carriage, Krull's final act of defiance against his master, and sped away into the night. As the castle disappeared into the distance, Cargrave looked back one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the silhouette of Sardonicus standing in a window, his face pressed against the glass, still twisted in its terrible grimace. The following day, news reached them that the castle had collapsed, as if it could no longer bear the weight of its master's sins. Sardonicus was never seen again, and the villagers spoke of the ruins as a cursed place, haunted by the echoes of his screams. Cargrave and Maud parted ways soon after, their reunion bittersweet. Though they had escaped the horrors of Castle Sardonicus, its shadow lingered over them both. For Cargrave, the memory of the Baron's grotesque grin would haunt him forever, a chilling reminder that some wounds could never be healed, and some curses could never be undone.